I'm Joan Marie Johnson. I'm the author of Funding Feminism, Monied, Women, Philanthropy, and the Women's Movement, and you're watching Author's Voice.
Good day, and welcome once again to the Author's Voice Network, where we connect authors to the entire world. This is my program's called Stranger Than Fiction, and I look like this because I stay up late at night reading books to give you the skinny on them right off the bat. I'm here today with our wonderful writer, Joan Marie Johnson, and this book is called Funding Feminism. We're going to be talking about. And Funding Feminism was published by the University of North Carolina. It's $40, it's a good value, and we're hoping to see you and hear from you today. At least hear from you. There are a few people in the shop. Snowing, cold, Chicago. You can stay home and just order this in the safety of your front room. And she will sign it for you, she will inscribe it for you. It's an important book, it's a timely book, it's unbelievably timely. And we'll be getting into a lot of details, we'll be getting into the overview that it presents. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Joan Marie Johnson. Joan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Why don't you tell us in a few minutes what pushed you over the edge, what got you to sit down, start the research, because it's really a labor of love. This was a lot of labor went into this compilation, this distillation of facts, figures, and females. Sorry, the alliteration was irresistible. I will pay for that. Tell us why you wrote this book, when you wrote it, how long it took you.
Well, I've written books before on women's activism, on women's clubs, education, social reform, race, gender. And so a lot about what women were doing and why they were doing it, but not as much about how they were doing it, which was the funding. But in thinking about their activism, really symbolized to me their ability to have a voice in society when they didn't have a political voice. And so I began to think a little bit more about how they got their voices known. And in part that came out of having the ability to fund a movement. And some of these wealthy women in particular were able to put a lot of money behind the movement for the right to vote, for birth control, to work with women in the labor movement, and to expand access to higher education for women. And their enormous financial contributions gave them a voice to make changes for women in society.
Do you describe, or rather, do you ascribe, way different word, do you ascribe to the theory of the great person in history? In other words, is where we are today really, really due to individual figures like Katherine McCormick and Margaret Sanger? Or do you believe that when a movement gathers strength to a degree, when the forces of societal change are poised for a momentum or an event rather, would someone else have filled those shoes, and would we have come to the same place? Was it such a time and place in this country whereby we were going to get to the spot by hook or by crook? Or do you think that these particular women, their personalities, people with the strength of, say, Bertha Potter Palmer comes to mind here in Chicago.
Right. Exactly.
Would we be in the same place today? Would somebody have filled all the shoes if you took out the top 10 names, so to speak?
Well, I think maybe eventually, but certainly not with the speed that it happened. So in other words, the movement for the right to vote had been going on for decades, and by the late 1890s, first couple of years of the 1900s, it was really, historians like to refer to it as being in the doldrums. They had gotten a few states where women had the right to vote, but the movement really was not making a lot of progress. And so at that moment, it really did take the enormous amount of funding that several women were able to give to the movement to kind of jumpstart it, to light a fire under the movement, and in particular, to be able to get the publicity that the movement needed to really change public opinion and get that ball moving. Now, it could have been moving. Eventually women probably would have gotten the right to vote anyway, but I don't think they would have gotten it in 1920 without the enormous impact that these women had. And the other thing I think is that there were many millions of women on the ground who were in favor of the right to vote. There was activism everywhere. There was grassroots activism going on. So I don't want to discredit the work of women everywhere and the work of women who didn't have a lot of money to give to the movement. But I think at this particular time in the early 1900s, when women didn't have a lot of economic power, that what $1 million gift from Mrs. Frank Leslie was able to do was really
especially
particularly
$1 million in, say,
impactful.
1910.
Yes, right. So exactly, the whole budget for the NASA, which was the National Organization for Women's Suffrage in 1913, was $38,000. So everything the entire organization did for the year was supposed to come under this $38,000 budget. And she gave, when she died, she left a bequest of $1.7 million to Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president of the organization. By the time the lawyers and family members all kind of got their piece of it, Carrie Chapman Catt was left with about $1 million. So, at a time when the budget was $38,000, here she is with $1 million at her disposal, and she really was able to make some significant changes to the way that they were running the movement, and that was pretty dramatic.
That's pretty phenomenal. And also dramatic are the amounts of money that some of the women had. If I'm not mistaken, later in the book, is it again Katherine McCormick who mm-hmm. overcomes the committed reticence of the board of directors at the Johns Hopkins University Press, offering them $13 million to build a medical school where women would be?
So that's Mary Garrett. That was Mary Garrett
okay.
In the early 1890s. Johns Hopkins, when he died, had left his fortune to build a college, a medical school, and a hospital. And they had built the college and they had built the hospital, but they had not built the medical school, and they had run out of money. Mary Garrett of Baltimore, who was the daughter of John Garrett, the owner of B&O Railroad.
Okay, that was a test, by the way, to see if you really knew your material.
Yes.
Okay. Well, at this point, we would like to remind you all at home to use the little button at the bottom of your screen to send in questions, to order the book. Just let us know what the question is, the town you're from, and we will pass that question along to Joan. And also, she will sign it for you and she will inscribe it for you. Again, the book is called Funding Feminism, and it is an incredible distillation of facts, figures, the power behind the movement that feminism relied on so strongly. Was it 1840, what, Seneca Falls?
1848.
1848.
The first women's rights convention in the world.
Now, you write in the book very honestly about there being any movement so broad, any movement so powerful, any movement so long in coming is going to have adherence to one faction or another. There are going to be differences of opinion as to how to proceed best for the bulk of women. And you had conflicts such as maternalism versus equality. Mm-hmm. Would you explain that briefly?
Sure. So some of the women at the time in the women's suffrage movement especially had become very active women, like Jane Addams, for example, with the social settlement movement. They were doing a lot of work aiding families, immigrants, child labor laws, all kinds of work. And they really saw that as their role as mothers, that as women, as mothers, they had a kind of moral duty and ability to clean up society and to provide these kinds of safety and security for women and children, and that's why they needed the right to vote. But the women in this book, for the most part, there are some exceptions, but for the most part, they really come at it more from the standpoint of equality, that as humans, women deserve the right to vote just as much as men. And one or two of them even mentioned that, no taxation without representation, that they vote, that they have, money and they pay taxes, and therefore they should have the right to vote as well.
And then we come up to the present day. I know we're talking about American women and American movement, but it was a comedian, and this is one of the darkest pieces of humor I've heard in a while, talking about how Saudi women are finally being allowed to drive cars themselves. Right. And he said, you notice that came shortly after cars were learning how to drive themselves. Yeah. So my point is this, that just, change takes a long time. The entrenched, the entrenched needs of the, I guess for want of a better word, the male sex. It's at least once every interview I find myself apologizing for being a man to the feminine gender, because we've done a lot of things wrong, and we're working on it. And one of them is for myself, is to get the word out for books such as this, and funding feminism, and the other things that we've been covering on this program. There are a lot of interesting points to be made. And I want to talk to you about. The idea that even though so much money was pushed into universities in what they call coercive philanthropy, okay, they still resisted. Even the University of Chicago was on the news last week that the woman, and I've got her name right here, and I will find it, the first African-American woman, I think, to get a PhD at the University of Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, was finally given a bust in the hall where she was not welcome to walk around in, back when she was a student, just after the turn of the century. And it's got to be it takes so much inner strength to continue in the face of male entrenchment. And I think that your book, to me, looks like a wonderful step. As I was saying earlier, before we started, I think, the camera rolling, that you will win every argument with this book under your shoulder, under your arm, because you have so many facts and figures down about that, and it's such a concise summation. And I'm wondering, what did you go through any literature? I mean, with the people in opposing viewpoints, maternalism versus equality, and there was a movement too with the Mink Brigade, where you had the very well-to-do people and socialites, and some of the more rowdy types, some of the more socialist leaning with actual political views that were taken to the streets. Some of them were being edged out of some of the movements because the power that be, or the female power that be, who was running that various organizations around the country, didn't want necessarily to alienate the money from the top.
So I think one of the reasons the book is so relevant today is thinking about how women are organized and have to kind of get past, build bridges across different identities, whether it's race or sexuality, and build a more comprehensive, cohesive movement that is that understands the intersectionality among different kinds of oppression and is one that is inclusive. And what we see in the book are these problems when we have wealthy women who are looking to use their wealth as power to make change for women, which is wonderful, but when they're in a women's organization and they're trying to wield their wealth as power to be able to make decisions for that organization or to shape the movement that it's going in, other women, as you mentioned, some of the labor women, for example, really resented that, and they resented the power that some of these wealthy women had. And it's interesting because this was going on at the time when Congress was investigating J.P. Morgan for having too much control over banking. And so you see a lot of headlines around money power and money rule. And within the suffrage movement, within the labor movement, you had women who were complaining about these wealthy women and saying, they're trying to exert money power and money rule. So I think it does have a lot of lessons for us about how to build a more cohesive movement.
So men and women do share a lot of human nature.
Yes.
Now, are there interesting archives around the country buried in different university libraries where you found letters detailing antagonisms between the women in the movement?
Yes, a lot of The suffragists, their letters are all saved. The Mary Garrett's letters. The universities have all sorts of records about the donations women were making there. And there is documentation about the differences among these women, as well as their cooperation as well. They all knew each other. They supported each other's movements. Mary Garrett, when she was giving money to Johns Hopkins in order to force them to open their medical school to women, she created a women's fund, and she had women in different cities who were all raising money together, and then she gave the bulk of it herself. But so these women had social networks with each other, and they certainly cooperated and collaborated together.
So how much time did the book take you? I mean, how much time did you spend? You must have gone around to these archives and look at them firsthand, because the detail is so rich and so specific that you couldn't just have accessed this easily without getting out there and getting your hands dirty.
Right. So I had the idea for the book about 8 years ago, and then I've been all over the U.S. from south, west, east, really archives everywhere, and have a lot of paper copies from the beginning, and then a lot of digital photos from the end of the research.
It almost sounds like a stealth project.
Yeah.
You finally launched it. At this juncture, we have a question.
Right.
And this comes from Jean in Houston. Hard to tell if Jean is a man or a woman.
Okay.
But since these women were moneyed and influential, she writes, was there any conflict between them and the rank and file activists? I should have read this question a few minutes ago, because you already answered that quite beautifully. Jean, I hope you're happy. We were prescient about what you wanted to know. So speaking of women, money, education, everything they wanted, this morning I was looking at the fact that in Chicago, there are 4 clubs for women downtown that I've never heard of. And one is the Chicago Network, another is the Professional Women's Club of Chicago, another is the Dynamic Professional Women's Networking Group, and then there's the Exclusive Professional Women's Networking Group.
Wow.
And I know there are other groups of women's organizations, and they seem very well organized in many respects, and I just find myself wondering how, they didn't seem, a lot of the younger women, would you say, and I'm asking you, I'm not telling you, they seem to have a very thin grasp of history. They take things for granted, and they don't realize that certain of our rights, your rights, are something that have to be fought for, defended every generation. As you write in the book, the pill was legal for married couples in 1965. It was only legal for individuals in 1972. And as I've said before too, a woman could not walk in the front door of the Union League Club of Chicago until 1972, I think. A woman senator could not take her seat on the Senate floor in a pantsuit until 1991. And the jaws drop when you say this. Jaws drop. You go, well, you need to read a little bit of history. And if that were the case, as I said with Kate Moore, with the Reading Girls, if that were the case, if people had read more, no large amount of women would have voted in an administration whose basic tenet was to reduce regulations on major corporations. But you do get the feeling, do you think that, how would you address this at the college level, say, where you say, you have a class called Wake Up? Wake up, the fight is now.
That sounds like a great idea. I think that a lot of women in college are woken up, and in high school as well. My daughter belongs to a feminist empowerment club at her high school, meets on Tuesdays. And I think what's happened is some of what we have taken for granted we're seeing being challenged right now, especially in terms of reproductive rights. Rights in the workplace. We see in the book they're fighting for equal pay. In the early 1900s, they're fighting for the right to unionize and the right to strike, and we see a lot of those rights being eroded now. And I think that a lot of people have taken, a lot of women have taken their rights for granted, and now there seems to be an urgency to fight for them, and an unmasking maybe of how contested those rights actually are.
That's it. That's it. The continual testing and contesting of women's rights goes on. I think that is the big lesson. That it's a sad lesson to realize, but it's almost like keeping good health. You have to exercise your entire life.
Right.
It doesn't.
Right.
There's not a set.
Right.
You have to do it.
And actually, Katherine McCormick is a great. You brought her up earlier. She's such a great example because she was a suffragist and an early supporter of Margaret Sanger in 1916 when Margaret Sanger first opened her birth control clinics, and she just continues to support her for decades and is then supports the development of the birth control pill in the 1950s. And then gives the money to MIT, her alma mater, in order to have women's dormitories to increase women in science education in the 1960s.
My God, she was as like a patron saint of Hedy Lamarr.
So she's fighting for 5 decades, over 50 years.
That's incredible. I mean, she should be on the $20 bill.
Yeah.
What I find sad and illuminating is how MIT didn't really develop an interest in having women at the school until what was it, $38 million dangled by the. It's sad,
When her husband
we should be
died
better than
and
that.
she inherited all that money, they said, send her a sympathy card and then talk to her
then
about
go
MIT.
after her.
I love
Right,
that letter.
right.
That was a good one from the MIT
And she put them
archives.
off for a while. You're right. She put them off. And,
she did. She took her time, and then she very carefully had some specific demands about building a dormitory, and the percentage of women at MIT increased dramatically.
Well, God bless her for that. We have another question.
Great.
Okay, this question comes from Nicole in Denver. Thank you, Nicole. Did the passing of time and change of social movement change the leadership of these movements? For instance, how is funding a movement during the progressive period different than the 1960s?
So I think that one of the things that's happening in the progressive period in the late 1800s and early 1900s is that women don't have a lot of economic power, and then you begin to have some of these women who are inheriting, many of them are widows or single women, and they're inheriting this Gilded Age fortune of their husbands who are railroad tycoons, et cetera. And so there's sort of this new money available to some of these very wealthy women in that time period. And I think as we've moved forward in time, obviously, there's still moneyed women. There's a lot of women who begin to develop their own businesses and are earning the money instead of inheriting it, and I think that makes a difference. As we get up into the 1960s, the Ford Foundation was one of the big donors to the civil rights movement and to the women's movement. So we also get infusions of money from other places as well. And then if we think a little bit more even about today with online fundraising, the Women's March on Washington raised something over $2 million from 38,000 plus people in just a couple months online on one of those online campaigns. So I think the ability to raise money from a lot of people today is much easier. So I think there have been a lot of changes over the last 100 years.
That's good. And speaking of the 1960s, you report something that I either forgot or never knew. There was a wonderful slogan that I think encompasses everything. Just says the personal is political.
Yeah.
The personal is political.
And boy, are we rediscovering that today?
That should be a T-shirt.
Yeah.
Because well, I can't go on about that because that's perfect. The personal is political. Remember that. It's amazing. You write about money and power, but it affects all areas of the lives of women across the country. And as something I read recently, that the first sculpture in New York City, for instance, to a living woman, not a woman dressed as Blind Justice or a Greek ideal,
Right.
was 1915, and that was Joan of Arc.
Oh.
1915. So men have been putting up sculptures and statues of themselves for 200 years in public spaces. It was 1915. It's just we should be ashamed of ourselves. We are ashamed of ourselves.
Yeah.
Tell me something about this book, because we really could talk for 5-6 hours about this. Tell me something about this book that I haven't asked that you want to make sure gets covered here.
Well, one of the things I think that is also relevant to today as well is that these women were really visionary in terms of their ability to fight for gender rights at a time when they really did not have a lot of power as women. And they had a lot of power from their race and their class privilege, but they experienced sex discrimination. They didn't get to do what their brothers did. They couldn't get the same access to education. So they really were visionary, but they did not extend that in thinking about race and challenging racism and other issues at the time. They saw that as a separate issue. They were not always, most often not welcoming to women of color in the movement. And I think that that's, again, another lesson for today in thinking about how feminism in fighting for rights and against hierarchy should be doing that on all fronts.
Although I did read in your book that there was a meeting with African American women as early as 1910, so there were some attempts made.
There were some,
There
yes.
were some attempts made.
Yeah.
And now I remember why I mentioned the sculpture of Joan of Arc.
Okay, not just because she's my namesake, right?
No. But there is a movement in New York. I believe they are going to put up. Go ahead, finish there.
No, you.
Oh, I was going to say I believe that it's a double sculpture or two sculptures, and one is Katie Stanton, and the other is
Is it Susan B.
Susan B. Anthony. Yeah, it's about damn time, because right now in public spaces in New York City, and I think you have 5 in public spaces. There are some in private spaces, but that you can espy from the street, but they don't count. So what do we have? Golda Meir, we have Harriet Tubman, and we have a couple of others, but including Gertrude Stein.
Well, I think the important thing about that is that the recent discussions about Confederate monuments have really shown us how significant public sculpture and public monuments are, and how whoever gets to put up those monuments in marble, gets to control some of the story that's being told to the nation, and so that's extremely significant.
And again, we have to redress so many things going on in the world of women, men. There's another book recently called "The Birth of the Chess Queen" by Marilyn Yalom, and I'll just say one thing about it, and is that a lot of people didn't know. I love chess, and I didn't know. I'm embarrassed. I didn't know that there was no queen in chess for the first 500 years of chess.
I didn't know that either.
There was no queen.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so we apologize again. And once women, again, money and power. This is a tightly thematic show. Don't get distracted.
Right.
Once women attained power through their connections to royalty. In other words, once the Western Renaissance, once the Middle Ages were passing into the Renaissance, you had strong women as queens. And so I think it was a Grand Vizier on the chessboard in the Middle East, India, and the Muslim countries were replaced by the queen.
I did not know that.
Long overdue. Long overdue. And the queen is a very powerful piece now.
Yes.
She's the most powerful single piece on the board. Whoop! At that time, that was the ghost of the chessboard there. At that time. The queen could only make one move, and now she can clean up the board. And so I hope that I'd like to see more women in power, more women in the Senate, more women in control of our.
These women were fighting. They knew they had to fight for political power, economic power, education, access to employment. They knew that all of these rights were, and reproductive rights, that they were all connected to each other, and that we had to fight for all of them at the same time.
I don't know how you did it. I mean, what is your next book? What's your next project? What are you thinking of?
I'm not quite sure yet. There are a couple of the women that I've discovered that I might want to write a little bit more about, and I might also want to move up into the 60s and 70s and 80s and think more about the women's movement more recently, and how that was structured and funded as well. So we'll see.
Is there a woman you know of that we don't know about that's behind the scenes, punching and pulling and scraping and trying all kinds of things to advance the movement?
Today? Not one in particular, but I think one of the things I've discovered as I've been going around talking about the book is that there are small groups of women all over who are really fighting. And I was meeting with one group in New Jersey, and they've just run one of their members for school board, and she won. And I think that kind of small group grassroots activity is really happening everywhere. Emily's List has said they've gotten thousands of requests for information about how to run for office from women across the country. So I wouldn't say there's one woman. I think there's a lot of women behind the scenes who are
Well, there would need to be.
some
There
change.
would need to be.
Yeah.
And is there one university press or one university, is there one area, is there one organization that stands out in their commitment to carrying on these ideals for women?
Well, I think political
I know there are
power
many.
is enormous. So I think everything from Emily's List on down to smaller organizations who are fundraising for women in political office are key. I think Planned Parenthood is absolutely essential. And I think there's also a lot of other organizations like Women Employed here in Chicago who are really working hard on women's employment issues for equality in the workplace. So I think those would be the three kind of areas for me that are the most important right now.
Well, thank you for that. And we're just about out of time. I would like to thank you for coming here today with your book, Funding Feminism, University of North Carolina, $40, 8 years in the making. Be impressed. Thank you for your stealth activities, because that's not easy. I know it's not easy.
Well, it's fascinating, so it makes it all worth it.
Okay. Good luck with this volume. And did they approach you? Did you approach them with the book?
I approached them. I, as a historian, had been doing this kind of writing and research, and had this idea, and they were interested. So it's been a great experience.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you at home. And I hope your fingers were busy on the buttons at the bottom of your screens. Joan will sign or inscribe a book to you. And we'll be here for a little while afterwards. Thank you for your questions. University of North Carolina Press, $40, Funding Feminism. And we wish you well this winter season.